Okay, hi guys, it's Mr.Y. Today we're going to be talking about patterns from the timeline of life's history on Earth. Now, this is a very long topic and you can take entire courses on this in college, so my little lecture today is just a very, very brief summary of all the things that we see in terms of patterns from all this history. Now, there are four main points I want to make sure you're aware of, and this is what I'm going to be emphasizing for the entirety of this lecture. The first is that the earliest forms, or the first forms of life on Earth, were very, very, what we would call simple by our standards. That is to say, they were unicellular, made of one-celled, so they were very, very small. You wouldn't be able to see them except under a microscope. And they were prokaryotes, meaning they had no major organelles, no nucleuses, no mitochondria, no rough endoplasmic reticulum, no chloroplast, nothing like that. And the reproduction method, because they were unicellular, means they had to reproduce asexually, which if you eventually learn the difference between mitosis and meiosis, you know that asexual reproduction is basically where the cell splits in two. It's a very simple form of reproduction. So everything about the first forms of life on Earth that we know of in terms of the fossil records indicates that it's a very, very simple starting area, not complex by any means. Eventually, in the fossil record, what we see is the buildup of photosynthetic organisms. That is to say, organisms that can do photosynthesis, that can take carbon dioxide and use it as an energy source with combination of sunlight to produce sugars for themselves. And as a result, you get out, of course, O2 gas. So we know, for instance, that early Earth's atmosphere had very little oxygen, and then it becomes more and more and more increased in the oxygen concentrations throughout the eons. This is because photosynthetic organisms became more abundant, and they're taking in more of the carbon dioxide that was around them and putting out more O2 into the atmosphere. We'll talk more about the effects of that later on. The other things we see in the fossil record is that after a point, we only see prokaryotic fossils. That is to say, as we go further and further back in time, after some point, there is no eukaryotes to speak of. There's no animals that we recognize as having anything to do with multicellular creatures, or there's nothing to do with organisms that would have cells that have nucleuses or anything. It just becomes very, very simple single-celled fossils, and those are in the oldest fossils we find. And we also know that these earliest organisms were almost entirely water-based. That is to say, they needed to live in water to survive. They did not exist in an air-based environment. So let's dive into that first one. As I said, the first forms of life were what we would call simple, unicellular, one-celled prokaryotes with no organelles. And because they're unicellular, we assume they reproduce asexually, because that's how we know all unicellular organisms today reproduce. This is probably the best approximation of an example of that. These little tufts here are actually single-celled algae growing on top of each other in huge colonies again and again every generation. You can see down here, this is actually the living part, and then eventually that part will die and a new layer will grow on top of it. And they grow in, yes, this very watery type of environment. And you can see this is not a rock here. This is actually layers of these guys building up after eons of growing on top of each other. So like I said, very simple single-celled organisms as the oldest fossils we know of. So the time span of this is about 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago, and we know this from doing half-life calculations on the rocks we find these things on. Again, very simple, single-celled organisms that reproduce asexually, having no nucleus, no mitochondria, none of that stuff. So they're probably using fermentation, if anything, to get sugars, unless they're doing photosynthesis later on. Because eventually we do see photosynthetic organisms. This happens about 2.5 billion years ago to 544 million years ago. There's kind of a big gap here because it's debatable when it starts and how long it takes before the oxygen can be picked up in the rocks we take half-life calculations from. But odds are it's a single-celled organism that starts having the ability to do photosynthesis, and that moves on to being in a symbiotic relationship. And there's a whole article on in your book, so please take a look at that if you wish. We do know that most photosynthetic organisms tended to be water-based initially because plants weren't around that far back. So whatever was starting to do photosynthesis, it was probably entirely happening in the oceans and the seas. And then the earliest true, what we would call organisms, multicellular organisms, are still entirely water-based. So even this thing here, which is, in fact, the oldest animal fossil you can find on Earth, at 650 to 544 million years ago, notice we're not talking billions, just millions of years, even this, it looks like something that would live only in a water environment. There's no way this thing lived on land based upon the structure and the geometry of it. So we see entire branches of different species, entire families of species evolving in the water well before we see anything on land. And this here is called a trilobite. These things were really, really extensive in the Earth's oceans for a long time. And this is a fossilized type of a fish species family that actually the entire family went extinct. And that's kind of the point I'm getting at here, is I'm kind of skipping over the fact that there are lots of cases of mass extinctions happening, where entire species died off because of some catastrophic event. There's at least 5, some people would argue 6 mass extinctions, but there are cases we know of, according to the geological record, where huge, vast areas of life just die off due to something happening or something changing in the Earth's environment. And as you can see with this fish species here, it's kind of a unique thing. I like it because it shows us a fish species where the bones actually evolved to be on the outside of the fish, and you have all the soft muscle and connective tissue, the fleshy parts, on the inside. So it's a very different take on our modern day fish. It's nothing like what we've seen today. And again, a lot of this was initially based upon what we would call the law of superposition. Sorry, I couldn't say it right. The law of superposition simply says that, well, if you look at the top layer of soil, this should be the youngest. Whereas if you look at a very, very deep layer of soil, that should be much, much older. Just the idea that the deeper in the ground you go, the further back in time you are looking. And this generally holds true, but there's 2 problems with it, as I've said before when we talked about HalfLife. One, it doesn't actually tell you how old things are. You can make estimations, but you're still just making an estimate. It doesn't actually say how many years went from here to here. That's where we need stuff like HalfLife. The other problem is when you have geological stuff happening, like earthquakes, plate tectonics, volcanoes, new land masses forming. That can screw up the layers. You can see there's a glitch here, probably from an earthquake or a plate shifting, and that can give you a misrepresentation of how old or how young something is. So that's where HalfLife comes in. Whereas the law of superposition is great for usually saying, this is older than this. It doesn't tell you how much older per se, and it doesn't tell you really how much older this is. You're kind of going based on a general guess. That's what we call relative dating. You're just saying this is older than this. That's it. Now, based upon actual half-life data, we know that prokaryotic fossils are found lower layers than eukaryotic fossils. So we know they are older, but thanks to half-life, we're actually able to get a really better estimate of how much older. And when we did the half-life calculations, it comes out that prokaryotes basically had the Earth to themselves for about 2 billion years. So at about 3.8 billion years ago, we find the earliest prokaryotes, and then it's another 2 billion years, so 2 billion years before you see anything that has a nucleus, mitochondria, rough endoplasmic reticulate. So just going from a simple cell to a slightly more complex cell took 2 billion years, and that's a lot of zeros. So for a long time, Earth was it was really just covered with, if any form of life, it's going to be very simple forms of single-celled bacteria. So again, the basic patterns, we see prokaryotic life proceeding means coming before, preceding eukaryotic life. So you find prokaryotes much, much older in the fossil record than you do eukaryotes. And because they're prokaryotic and they're single-celled, we assume that means asexual reproduction, a very simple form of reproduction, preceding sexual reproduction, like most eukaryotic forms of life do today. And that's, of course, means we have unicellular life preceding multicellular life, and that the earliest forms of organisms appear to be entirely water-based, and it's not till later that you see things that looked as though they could survive on land. So overall, we get this general pattern of having anatomically simplistic forms of life with very little variation, not a whole lot of variation. And yes, you do have occasional mass extinctions that help with this, but somehow we have this variation that's very little give a lot of complexity give rise to a lot of complexity that we see today. Lots of variation today. And again, keep in mind, there are many cases where the complexity died out thanks to mass extinctions. So even with all those mass extinctions, this was still happening. And so for many, many years, biologists were wondering, well, how the heck does this work? How do you go from anatomically simplistic forms of life to having much more complex forms of life? Because that's what the fossil record was telling us. And that's what we're going to be covering in our next lecture. So make sure you understand these key points and then ask questions if you're not sure about any of the technical terms.